started, it's traditional for the advisor to say a few words before we start. And so I have a few words, and I'll try to keep it to a few words as we will be a little bit strapped for time. We will have a couple people filing in as we go, and that's expected as well. So for those of you online especially, there's a lot that it takes to get a PhD. To some extent, a simple way of saying what a PhD is learning enough about a field to be able to identify a gap that experts in the field have not addressed, coming up with a plan to address that, and then executing that and being able to communicate. That's not an easy task. And it's not an easy task to do in 4 years or 5 years or 6 years, to learn enough about a field to find a gap that experts have not addressed and to be able to address that gap. So that's always difficult. But Rex has had to overcome a lot more, I think, in his time as well in working for that PhD than the average student has. He switched labs midway through under difficult circumstances and came to our lab, of which we were working on some different things. They're connected, but to some extent he had to relearn what we do. He had to learn the literature behind what we do, and again, help find another gap and address it as well. But he did it under really unique circumstances. When he made the move to UW-Madison, unfortunately, right before COVID, he was out of the country. And he spent the first, essentially, year attempting to learn what our lab does remotely from another country while trying to plug in. That's incredibly difficult circumstances. So he's had to overcome some challenges, and he's had some blessings on the way. The blessings, he's had multiple children during this time period as well. Those are not, they are well known for taking your time, and it's another difficult thing to spend that time, but during a PhD structure. He's completed 2 internships during this time as well. So to some extent, you can't overcome those challenges alone. And so what we have right now is, to some extent, a thank you to friends, family, collaborators. This public session is actually for you. You can't do this sort of thing alone. And so Rex has had to overcome these challenges with your help, and to some extent, the time you put in, you're going to see what you paid for here. So there's going to be a public session that the talk will go somewhere around 50 minutes, and that is for you to explain to you his science, and I think you're going to be really proud of what he's done with your support. Second, then you'll get to ask a couple of questions publicly, then we'll go to a closed session where his committee members will ask him some more detailed technical questions as well. And given this has a theme of what Rex has overcome, to some extent, getting a PhD is about knowledge, it's about ingenuity, but to overcome these challenges, it's a lot of perseverance. I'm gonna, before I hand it over to Rex, quote one of the poets of our time. Rex may not know this reference. There may be several people in the room who don't know this reference, but as he has had multiple daughters, he's probably gonna have to get to know this poet. So, to quote Taylor Swift, players gonna play, 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 play. Haters gonna hate, 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 hate. God, how the rest of the I'm just gonna shake, 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 shake. You gotta shake it off, shake it off. So with that, Rex, the floor is yours.
Price wisdom.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming for my defense. My research is about how to clear waste from the brain. But my wife says I should start with clearing the waste from our home. Today I'll be sharing my dissertation titled Refining Immediate Biomarker Techniques for Assessing Target Engagement in Neuromodulation. Neuromodulation is an FDA-approved approach for treating various neurological disorders. It involves the use of electrical stimulation to modulate neural activities in the brain or peripheral nerves. For instance, vagus nerve stimulation is indicated for epilepsy, depression, and heart failure. Spinal cord stimulation is indicated for chronic pain syndrome, and deep brain stimulation is indicated for Parkinson's. In our lab, we're exploring the potential of neuromodulation to improve brain health by enhancing its natural waste management system. This system, called glymphatic system, which uses cerebral spinal fluid, CSF, to flush out harmful substance. This process is closely linked to healthy blood flow in the brain, and essentially pushing substance around the blood vessels channels. Improving the system could help clear out damaging molecules like misfolded protein, which accumulate in conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, and traumatic brain injury. This is my wife. To enhance this clearance system, we are exploring a non-invasive method using gentle stimulation of peripheral nerves, such as those through mouth guard stimulator. These nerves connect the brain and spinal cord to the rest of the body. By stimulating them, we can influence blood flow in the brain and boosting CSF movement, helping the brain clear out the waste more effectively. Our goal is to harness this approach to slow down the progression of a neurodegenerative disease and assist in recovery from brain injuries. If we can enhance waste management in the brain, we might open new doors for treating disease such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. In today's presentation, I'll first discuss how we refine the precision of nerve stimulation for targeting specific pathways. Then we'll explore how we can consistently increase blood flow to drive this process. So the first part of my presentation will focus on improving the precision of peripheral nerve stimulation. The second part will focus on how we can consistently increase blood flow in the brain. The first step of our approach is to assess target engagement with the peripheral nerve. Specifically, we need to determine whether we can selectively activate desired pathway without triggering off-target effects that could undermine our intended outcomes. And this is the primary focus of our M1, developing a strategy to better understand the peripheral nerve pathway that we are engaging. Let's start with a little bit of peripheral nerve anatomy. Peripheral nerves are composed of several fascicles, which are bundles of nerve fibers. Each fascicle contains individual nerves of various sizes, and these nerves classify based on their conduction velocity. And which lead to the classification of different fiber types, A alpha, A beta, and so on, with Greek letters as subtypes. For example, myelinated axon, or A fiber, have different subtypes. A alpha fibers have fast conduction velocity between 70 to 120. A beta have velocity of 30 to 70, and so on. And A alpha and A beta are connected, for example, innervate neck muscles for vagus nerve stimulation for heart failure, for example. Activation of these fibers are considered side effects because it will contract the neck muscles and lead to discomfort, which is what we want to avoid. B fibers, for example, have conduction velocity between 3 to 15, slower and smaller. For treating heart failure, these are our target fibers. C fibers are generally slower and unmyelinated, doesn't have the insulation layer, and could travel at less than 2 meters per second. So So these fibers not only carrying different information, they also have varying activation threshold. So for example, on this side, you have large myelinated fibers that require very little stimulation. It's more insulation. And then on the top left, you have fibers that are like B and C and require a lot more stimulation currents. The current challenge in neuromodulation therapy development is the difficulty in producing precise recruitment of target nerves. Let's say we have a target nerve, such as the B fiber for heart failure, that when engaged will produce intended therapeutic effect. And then we place an electrode to produce the electric field. For example, at this low dose, this dashed line mark is the recruited volume, how much tissue are recruited. We're not activating the target nerve. And now we increase a little bit of our amplitude. Now we're recruiting the target nerve, and this is good. But now if we increase it even further, we might activate the off-target nerve. In this case, might be a alpha fiber that causes the neck contraction, which is not good. This example shows precise recruitment is essential for the success of a therapy in terms of producing therapeutic effects over side effects. Precise recruitment is not only important for patient programming, as our example shows, but also for battery life. It indicates how many reoperation surgeon or surgeries a given patient might need. Another factor is for achieving precise recruitment, electrode design. Electrode design can help us steer the electric field to produce precise recruitment. The question is, how do we assess whether we are achieving precise recruitment in terms of the location and the volume? Currently, it's difficult to assess nerve recruitment. Existing tools like functional magnetic resonance imaging can show oxygenation in the brain and spinal cord. Magnetic resonance neurography can show detailed nerve anatomy. EMG, electromyography, can show nerve muscle contraction. Evoke compound action potential, ECAP, can show which fiber types are being engaged, but do not provide precise information about volume and location of a nerve activation. If all the current functional tools we have seen fell short of reporting the recruited volume or location, how do current companies iterate their electrode design? Company turns to computational modeling. The approach involves using finite element model to simulate electric field produced by their electrode design and a nerve anatomical model to simulate nerve recruitment. These models are beneficial for development because they help us see trends and iterate design efficiently. However, it has significant challenges with this approach. Current model can only be validated at populational levels with populational averages, which means the model may not accurately reflect individual variation in nerve anatomy and responses. While ECAP, Evoke Compound Action Potential, was mentioned earlier as a tool that does not assess nerve recruitment volume and location, it provides confirmation which fiber types, the A, B, and C fiber types, can be or are being engaged by the stimulation. It has gained significant adaptation and interest in the industry in the last few years, with numerous companies starting to use it for closed loop stimulation, for better target engagement, and many others are moving in a similar direction. While I was embarking on a journey, to write a tutorial about ECAP best practices, I noticed a phenomenon that has not been discussed in the literature. But before we dive into what I discovered, let's visit some of the concepts we need to understand this phenomenon. A neuron's membrane has a difference in membrane voltage. And with natural input or electrical stimulation, this potential can rise. And when it reaches negative 50 millivolt, it can trigger rapid opening of these sodium channels and subsequent potassium channels and changes the membrane potential. These tiny openings will allow a large influx of the sodium ions and essentially causing a firing phenomenon. And this firing phenomena essentially is like a domino chain effect down the chain of the segments of axons. Let's talk about evoked compound action potential. When we apply stimulation to a nerve using an electrode, we produce an electric field, and this electric field recruits a portion of the nerve and marked it by the boundary here that we see. And within this volume, you could see action potential are actually initiated at multiple locations and producing, and they propagate along. And when they are generated, they propagate in both directions. And when two action potential that are travel in the opposite direction run into each other, they will collide and nullify each other. And then a phenomenon is known as collision block. And there will be some, action potential that are at the boundary that doesn't run into another one. They will propagate outward and reach recording electrodes. And when we detect them as signal, we consider them as evoked compound action potential. It has the word compound because it represents the combined activity of multiple axons, multiple nerves. Here's some data recorded from vagus nerve of a pig under paralytics for noise reduction. We place stimulation electrode close to the nodal ganglion, which is for human is behind our skull here, and at the bottom of our skull, and with 6 electrodes for recording several centimeters down. And we use them to create 2 ECAP channels. So starting at a low dose of 1.2 milliamp, we saw no response. And as we increase the dose, we start seeing something. And now upon increasing the dose, we're seeing this clear difference in delay of this channel. So what is this? It's like you have a car driving at constant velocity on the highway, and then you have like multiple cameras looking at the highway, and this car will show up the image of different cameras at a delayed time. And then with this delay and the distance between the camera, you can calculate the signal velocity. And this is the same thing where we got, for example, we got A beta signal after calculation. It has velocity around 50 meters per second. And then as we increase the dose, now we also have A alpha fiber around 30 meters per second. And then now if we increase the dose even higher, the slowest signal come in here that we can detect is A delta or B fiber. So far, what we've seen, the data is very similar in literature, but with one phenomena that we have not seen and discussed in the literature. Let's zoom in here. We only look at just one channel, and then let's look at these peaks. So you see the peaks get closer, or the delay is shrinking as we increase the dose. So I brought this to Kip, and Kip said, this might be something we need to look into. Maybe the location where the signal comes from are different. And this makes me think deeper about the data. So I started to consider the underlying mechanism. Let's see if the next slide can help us understand this. So starting with a small stimulus amplitude, we have some recruited volume on the left and right, and then the nerve signal has to travel this much of distance to reach our recording electrodes. And then as we increase the dose, like we got a bigger volume and this boundary shifts, and the distance, the signal from the boundary to the recording electrode has shrunk. And if I increase further, it gets smaller and smaller. So ideally, these signals travel at the same velocity with shorter travel distance. The signal will take less time to arrive, resulting in the earlier recorded signal that we saw. This is starting to make sense. The question is, can we calculate this? After thinking about it for a couple weeks, I realized we can find the velocity of the fiber, v. We know the travel time, how much time the signal has traveled, because we produce the stimulus. Using the formula v times t equal distance, we can determine how far the signal has traveled. This helps us to pinpoint where the signal originated, which we call the activation origin of ECAPs. Let's say we have stimulating electrode at the bottom with 5 electrodes on the top. And I create this graph to help us visualize the space and time together. So this is time equals 0 line, and x-axis represents time, and y-axis represents space and distance along the nerve. As we activate the nerve, let's assume we only have one fiber type that travel at the same velocity. The signal then propagate along the nerve and hitting the channel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sequentially, creating these delays that you see. Stuck. Before calculating the distance the signal has traveled, we need to find the velocity. So to figure out the velocity, we can find peaks within the signal, and then once we have peaks, we have the delay time between the channel, and then we know the distance of the electrode, and just take the distance divided by the time, we got the velocity. Once we find the velocity, in fact, we can draw a line. This line it's interesting to think about this line. What this line represents in this space-time graph is it could tell us where exactly the signal was at any given moment. And if you draw this line, so for example, at this moment t, the signal is in the middle of recording and stimulation electrodes. And if we trace this line back to time 0, you essentially could find the activation origin, which is the recruitment volume boundary that we were looking for. Another way to look at this is once we find the velocity, we can find out how much this signal essentially traveled, and then we could just multiply the velocity times t, travel time, and then refer to the location of our recording electrode. Then we find the activation origin. Before we dive into how this calculation can help us understand recruited volume, let's visit how electrical stimulation activates nerve. Here's the cathode, negative electrode. it attracts positive ions from extracellular fluid, reducing the positive charge outside of the membrane, causing depolarization. The essentially you have some positive ion closer, and that creates the difference in membrane voltage. And here, so essentially right under the cathode, you got this depolarization zone, and it is where this depolarization zone on the nerve activates the nerve. And for anode, the positive electrode, the opposite happens, where we have the ion actually pushes away. Positive ion pushes away and increase the positive charge outside of the membrane and causing hyperpolarization, which does the opposite. It inhibits the neuron. Okay, with this understanding, let's put our calculation to test. Can our activation origin method truly pinpoint where a signal is coming from? Here's how we will test it. We use two different cathode locations. Cathode activates nerve. And the idea is simple. If our activation origin location aligned with the cathode position at threshold activation, then we know our calculation is accurate. First, we place our cathode closer to our recording electrodes, and since we're at threshold activation, we expect a very small recruited zone, and the activation should locate very clear to here. And let's see our result. So this is our, so now look at this. The activation origin, so we get the peak and then we draw the line and pointing back. It is close to our cathode location. In fact, as we increase the dose, you could see that this is zoom in, so you could see that at the lower dose, it's a little bit inaccurate, but remember, just by the way, this is 8 centimeter away, so we essentially calculate 8 centimeter away, so this few millimeter error is reasonable. And then as we increase the dose, we see the recruited volume essentially expands, and then activation origin is marking the boundary of that recruited volume, so it moves away as we increase this dose. This is amplitude on the x-axis, and this is y. Now let's switch to a different cathode location on the cranial side or on the top. And again, we see the calculation can pinpoint the location accurately. And again, as we increase the dose, now we see the activation origin or the recruited volume boundary pushes closer, essentially as the volume expands. This is a monopolar.
It's monopolar.
Yeah.
And what's the return?
It's distant.
So where's the anode?
It's
a distant anode.
Yeah, it's like a big pad.
Got it.
Yeah, steel pad. Okay, so so far, so far, we've seen the activation origin for negative electrode, cathode. Let's look at the positive electrode, anode. But before that, let's quickly revisit how cathodes and anodes activates nerve or affect nerves. As we saw before, the cathode is responsible for producing the primary depolarization zone. But the story does not end here. According to Rank 1975, during cathodic stimulation, any outward currents, so currents go from the inside of the nerve to the outside, causes local depolarization, which activates nerve. However, to conserve the charge, there must be an inward current elsewhere. And this inward current elsewhere could cause hyperpolarization. These are hyperpolarization regions that adjacent to the depolarization regions can inhibit neurons. Since the cathode is typically considered as depolarizing and anode typically hyperpolarizing, these areas are termed virtual anodes, can effectively limit the growth of the nerve activation volume. Conversely, during anodic stimulation, adjacent to the central hyperpolarized region, depolarization zone can occur on the side. And this typically happens at 2 to 3 times of the threshold needed for cathodic stimulation. So the takeaway is the cathode negative electrode activates at the center, but inhibits neuron slightly removed region. And for positive anode, it inhibits them at the center, but outside of center, it activates nerves at 2 to 3 times of the threshold. So when we activate with the anode, we should expect that the activation is a little bit removed away from the center of the electrodes, as well as it will expand more dramatically compared to cathode. So this is exactly what we see with activation origin. Compared to activation threshold of cathode at 0.8 milliamp, which we have seen this graph, an anodic activation has a threshold of 1.6 milliamp in the same animal, same setup. As we expected, the location of activation origin at threshold is not directly under anode in both cases, and as we increase the dose, the activation origin shift more dramatically than cathode. And in addition to that, in this anode on the top scenario, we see that in fact the activation origin shift from one side of the insulation edge to the other, and this is likely a nonlinear effect produced by these insulation edges, right? Because you have electrical field, you have insulation, it creates a different effect without the insulation, and essentially enhancing the virtual cathode effect, a phenomena actually predicted in the previous simulation study. Now we could see it in actual recording. So let's take one step back. We started with a phenomenon not explained in the literature before. Increasing the dosage or stimulation amplitude causes reducing propagation delays of ECAP signal, to realizing that expanding recruited volumes are the causes. And this is exact phenomena that help us determine the boundary of the recruited volume, which we call activation origin of ECAP. We then demonstrate the calculation origin by multiplying the velocity v with the length of time the signal has traveled. We tested our calculation and validate that it accurately locates the 2 different positions of cathode. This revealed details of activation landscapes that align with theoretical nerve activation models. Kip likes to say, don't date electric field because it will cheat on you. Hopefully, as this tool becomes more available, we can validate and better understand the behavior of the electric field, leading to more reliable partnership with electric field for neuromodulation. Returning to our original challenge, we need a way to assess neural recruitment. in terms of volume and location to inform our therapy design, iterate electrode design, and validate computational models with activation origin framework that produces clear boundary and location of recruited volume. We can now assess recruited volume in individual patients or animals fulfilling the affirmation goals. The activation origin framework now enables ECAP to be the answer, bring the critical piece of information on recruited volume. It can build on top of the current trend of companies moving toward adding sensing capability to their neuromodulation devices. The activation origin framework will now provide ground truth to modeling, which was previously difficult to validate. This is a major step toward enabling truly personalized models grounded in patients' own data. There are numerous potential of activation origin framework, including personalized computational modeling, which we have already discussed, electromigration detection. Electromigration is a major issue that requires reprogramming or reoperation. With activation origin, we can pinpoint where the recruited volume is and enabling migration detection that triggers an alert or reprogramming to restore the intended stimulation location. Closed loop stimulation, instead of the current common approach of using constant current stimulation or constant voltage as the indicator for feedback mechanism, we can now use recruited volume as an indicator that might be more reliable in terms of when we move and change the impedance of our electrodes, which essentially your stimulation is going to change. Another major one, neural versus non-neural signal classification. ECAP signals are often contaminated by multiple sources of ECAP signals, multiple sources of artifacts. Neural signal possesses distinct biophysical features that propagates along the axons, leading to the feature of activation origin that we have seen. But for example, muscle signal can also contaminate our results. Motion artifact can contaminate as well. But they don't possess this property of moving along an axons. So can we use activation origin to identify them? Here's an example in a pig model. With stimulation with varying amplitude, we observe multiple signal. Signal in 1 and 2 shows up as 0.2 milliamp. And as we increase the dose, 3 and 4 also shows up. Let's zoom in a bit. You see, this is 1, signal 2, signal 3, and signal 4. And you can see they have delays. And we can calculate the velocity. Signal 1 has 51 meters per second, and signal 2 and 3, negative 500. Probably not neural signal. So signal 4, it's 31 meters per second. Well, typically you would just classify them based on their velocity. So then this might be A alpha or A beta, this might be A beta or A gamma. So is that true? All right, now we apply vacuronium, which blocks the muscle contractions. Now you should not have any artifacts. So signal 1 remain, signal 2, 3, 4 disappear. In fact, we have other signal come in that shows up. There are neural as well. But the point is 2, 3, 4 disappear. So if we just use velocity, here we go, we misrepresent the A beta and A gamma. Sorry, we represent this signal as A beta and A gamma, and in fact, it is EMG. So what about activation origin. We can calculate actually this signal, their activation origin. And in fact, now if we calculate them, signal 1, very close to stimulation electrodes, signal 2, 3, out of window because it doesn't have much delay. Signal 4 has some delay, but it is very far from the stimulation electrode, so it's not feasible, plausible. So just by quickly doing activation origin, we can complement velocity calculation to filter out the signal that could be misidentified as neural signal. So far, we have established a way to reliably assess target engagement. Our next objective is to confirm whether we can consistently produce cerebral blood flow changes. We need to identify how different stimulation patterns can influence cerebral blood flow and ensure these responses can consistently replicate it. However, with current technology of peripheral nerve stimulation, we still often limit by off-target effect, and this stimulation essentially activates patterns in the brain, and we cannot pinpoint where we want to stimulate very easily. So for this study, to refine our approach, we use optogenetics to generate action potential via light stimulation in transgenic mice. It's like using flashlight to activate neurons. By directly activating neurons, we can bypass the peripheral pathway that allow us to, precisely map the relationship between action potential that we produce with light and their blood flows that surrounds our brain cells. This method not only provides clear insights into localized effects, it can also serve as a foundation for designing a system that can reliably modulate cerebral blood flow through peripheral nerve in the future. To measure the response from the blood flow, we use optical coherence tomography, OCT, which is an imaging technique that uses light to capture high-resolution cross-sectional images of biological tissues. Some of you might have experienced OCT during eye exam. It's getting more and more popular for checking retinal health. So this allows us to visualize blood flow changes in real time and monitor the effects of our flashlight stimulations on certain regions of the brain. So let's talk a little bit about neurovascular coupling. Cerebral blood flow is delivered by vasculature. Essentially, it's interconnected pipes, networks with unique morphology, shape, and structure. Neurons are highly demanding, energy demanding cells, and to meet its demand, this is made possible due to a robust relationship between brain cells and their nearby vessels, known as neurovascular coupling, NVC. Let's watch a video that illustrates this concept. So this is during whisker stimulation. You see brain cell light up, and then arterial walls expand, and thus causing blood flow increase in the upstream larger vessels. Reason finding, this is drawn by my wife, by the way, suggests a unified theory with two components of neurovascular coupling, acute and delayed. The acute component involves fast electrical signaling. Endothelium cells, the vessels walls of the vessel walls, yes, detect rising potassium levels from nerve activation, triggering a hyperpolarizing signal that travels along the vessel walls, dilating arterial and larger arteries at a speed of 2 millimeter per second, and which likely has a far-reaching effect. The delay component involves slower processes via substance such as nitric oxide and carbon dioxide. This process maintains levels of these byproducts, and vasodilation propagates at 5 to 20 micrometer per second. In summary, the acute response driven by fast electrical signal likely has a far-reaching effects or influence, while the delay response involves slower diffusive processes. So our study shows exactly that, with varying stimulation duration. With 1 second stimulus, we see a peak response at 2 to 3 seconds. With similar as 2-second stimulus, at 4 seconds, the delay response begins to appear, and then by 8 seconds, this delay response peaks around 25 seconds, and by 12 seconds, the delay response dominates and making the initial peak hard to observe. This result shows a two-phase response, a quick peak at 2 to 3 seconds, and followed by a slow response at 25 seconds. This is quite complicated and nonlinear. So if we want to control it, we need to keep that in mind. How about spatial relationship? We also need to know where to target. So is there a one-to-one mapping, spatial mapping between the blood flow increase and the underlying neuroactivity? So to study that, we will essentially create a grid of 25 stimulation locations nearby vessels of our interest. And here's an example of a response. For example, from the stimulation location 1, and then that's where we are scanning the cross-section. Then we move on to the second location, and then we measure the response again. This is just an example. And then we go to the third, and we complete this 25 location. And then in fact, we can actually measure blood vessels flow response at multiple locations simultaneously. So we're like stim and scanning simultaneously. Let's examine a vessel response. For stimulation location 1, this is the response. Stimulation location 13, this is the response. And this is stimulation 25. And the color map behind this is actually the peaks at the delay response that we saw before, and that registered into false color. So the result indicate that the maximum response, since we are recording from here, the maximum response is not, if you stimulate here, you're not going to get that, and sometimes we get no response. In fact, the maximum response of a given monitored blood vessel comes from its feeding territory. When you stimulate the location that blood vessel is feeding, then you will get the maximum response. So this essentially, we also see that that's for the larger essential delay peak, but for acute peak, if you look at further away, sometimes you could still see response. So just see there might be a further reach for acute response. So now, so far we look at the blood flow. In fact, this technique actually give us an entire cross-section. We can also summarize data based on maximum blood velocity. And here you can see we get a pretty similar response. Now let's look at from different vessels. This is vessel 1 to 4. In fact, something really interesting happens. Stimulation location at location 15 leads to this blood flow increase in vessel 4, while it caused a blood flow drop minimally, but it caused significant reduction in velocity, and this is the color. The blue is showing reduction. So this is really interesting because, you know, essentially you're stimulating one area that caused a significant increase in one blood vessel, and the other one you cause reduction. And that's kind of makes sense because flow has to come from somewhere. So let's illustrate this with this video. So let's start the stimulus, and then you can see the velocity drop, some flow drop, and as the time goes on, the increase go away. And then you actually get everywhere become blue because there's a large, essentially, post-stimulus drop that occurs, which we have seen a little bit before. So after these two tests, we discover to evoke consistent blood flow increase, we need to stimulate the feeding territory of a vessel. We also realize there is a nonlinear relationship between the stimulation parameters and the resulting changes in blood flow. If we want to control it consistently, can we account for this relationship through some methods? And this is where, to do this, we implement a closed loop controller. It's like a thermostat for blood flow in the brain. Proportional integral derivative controller. The PID controller serves as a heuristic method that essentially allowing us to stabilize the blood flow changes even in the presence of nonlinear dynamics. So to do this, we modify our system to essentially process the blood flow signal that you saw in real time, and then we can then set the desired blood flow level. Let's say we want to increase 15%. The PID controller will compare the OCT blood flow measurement with these set points, and then adjust the laser pulse width in real time. And again, it works like a thermostat. If your current blood flow is below the set point, then you'll see lots of your pulse width will increase, and if you saw it below the set point, then it will, above the set point, then it will essentially stop the stimulation. So starting with 30 seconds of baseline, and then you could see that the controller is now on for 15% increase, and it stabilizes it and maintain it at target level, and then matches the target. And as it turn off, the blood flow drop below the baseline. So we see similar behavior for 5% and 10% as well. This is 15, 10, and 5. And these are the blood flow response. So it's clear now that even with the nonlinear and inconsistent response of cerebral blood flow after stimulation, we could still control the blood flow consistently with PID controller. this essentially helps us build a simple model that links the input from the brain stimulation to the changes we saw in the CBF. In fact, we have to tune this PID controller. This is really, I'm EE by training, so I was very excited that I could use similar things. So I use a method called Niklas Ziegler. I talked to some control engineer and they use this all the time in chemical plants. So this is how it works. You essentially increase the dial of a proportional gain and essentially look at the difference between your set point and your current blood flow. And then you just crank it up the P gain to a point that it starts oscillating. You see it start oscillating? And then you get that frequency of oscillation as well as this gain noted. And then you divide it by 3, essentially. And now you dial in a little bit of derivative gain. A derivative gain essentially look at the fluctuation, and what it helps with is it helps it stabilize it. And then now you continuing on you realize there's what we call steady state error. That's like a step difference at like a longer horizon, and you can use integral gain to increase that gain. And here you can see the final one not only reaches the response quickly and doesn't oscillate that much, and it has a minimal steady state error that centers around our set points. Well, we also have explored some more sophisticated model to handle complex interactions between different vessels, including controlling multiple branches of blood vessel simultaneously rather than focusing on one. So here you can see these are 2 different PID controller that are targeting different locations and blood vessels. Obviously, they're interconnected, so there are going to be some flow competitions and different things going on. So here you can see if I stimulate one or set up the controller one, we can increase the blood flow, and we are also affecting the other one. And in this case, we are setting both at different set points. And you can see how PID controller interact essentially differently with individual blood vessels. So it is actually get really complex because the tunings and everything got really complex. So and we actually went down to the route of developing advanced models, and which I would not go in to talk about, but essentially handle looking at the network and also modeling optogenetics, neurons, and modeling the subsequent neurovascular coupling changes in individual vessels. But for the curious ones, you can visit my dissertation and you can find more detail. So building on these principles, we realized it's possible to control cerebral blood flow. And in fact, our lab has recently begun applying peripheral nerve stimulation in human study to induce changes in cerebral blood flow and cerebral spinal fluid movement. With permission from Kip, I can share some peripheral findings. So actually, collaboration with Wally Block and Robert Moskwa have yielded some imaging and statistics analysis that demonstrate consistent blood flow, increased changes that lead to enhanced cerebral blood flow movement during peripheral nerve stimulation. Here we see that CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, around the middle cerebral artery increase during peripheral nerve stimulation in an awake human subject. These early results suggest that our approach might support the brain clearance mechanism and potentially benefiting patients with traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's diseases. So we are optimistic that our ongoing research can pave the way for novel therapeutic intervention aimed at improving brain health by leveraging target peripheral nerve stimulation. Our current work laid the groundwork for deeper understanding of how peripheral nerve stimulation can drive significant changes in brain function, ultimately offering potential therapeutic avenue for neurodegenerative diseases and brain injuries. During my PhD, I have the opportunity to contribute to several publications. Author, I published 2 papers that we talked about earlier, which are related to the blood flow controller. Additionally, I have been mid-author on 3 other papers: a systematic review, look at the quality of evidence for irregular vagus nerve stimulation, a method paper that using ultrasound to image the vagus nerve in a surgical setting, and OCT imaging paper focused on retinal imaging, which was with the collaboration with Wisconsin Medical College during the first part of my PhD. We also have some work in preparation. The first upcoming one is related to the activation origin that you have seen. Another paper is on polarization sensitive OCT imaging, a collaboration with Harvard Medical School and the FDA. And the third manuscript dives into the prevalence of sympathetic fiber within the vagus nerve and its implication. In addition, we have 2 pending patents. The first patent is based on the finding, again, from activation origin. The second one is the patent comes from our OCT work. So here are some rewards I was fortunate to receive. 3 poster competition and a cool science image contest at UW-Madison. And this is the image of a rat muscle neck and, rat neck. And you can see the vagus nerve is this large red signal in the middle, and these green are muscles and collagens, and the red are other nerves. I want to express my deepest gratitude to everyone who supported me throughout my PhD. To my advisor, Kip, I couldn't have asked for a better mentor. Your support during challenging times, especially through COVID, and your example of empathy and humility. I always say it wrong. Just shaped me both personally and professionally. Thank you for guiding me thoughtfully. To my community member, Justin, Kevin, Wooly, and Wendell, and also Sarah. Your support during my move from Milwaukee to Madison was invaluable. To Wheaton communities, I'm grateful for each of you and making this journey both fun and enjoyable despite long experiment days. And James, our conversations are some of the most intellectual stimulating experience, helping me grow both as a thinker and a researcher. We had a 3-hour conversation 3 weeks ago. Nishan, hopefully you're here. Your mentorship on career navigation opened my eyes to new career path. Ash, thank you for always sucking me into discussion that I said I'm not going to get into. And you're a great sounding board. Thank you. Tom, hopefully he's here, Rickner, and Aaron Saminsky. I just thank you so much for guiding me through, or your mentorship and your friendship are just vital when I was in Milwaukee. I remember I'll call him overseas at sort of when I thought of him, but I hope that's not. His name has always show up on my phone book, first one, because he started with A. So I thought of him a lot. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin, for your. You just have a very good hand. You want to build something, go to Kevin, and he'll make it happen. Brandon, thank you for, your network, your advice, saved me so much brain headaches that I could have. And Maria, well, your reminder has been keeping me in line. Megan, Bruce, thank you for teaching me surgeries. And Bruce actually helped me in COVID online. During their surgery, he teach me how to do rat surgery, so I could do it in Taiwan. So that was a lifeline. So Ricardo, Aaron Ghostin, Jared, and Joy, some of you might be here, might not, but I appreciate your friendship and experimental help and many other things that we can enjoy together. We enjoy together. To Samir and Fareed, who endure the same transition process like I do, and I did. Thank you for your friendship and walking along with me. And we are in such a better situation. I'm really happy that you too. And yeah, Fareed, if you're here, we have such a wonderful time of 20 hours together or 24 hours together, driving from Milwaukee, pack up the instrument, drive to Madison, dump, unload them, set up the instruments and run the experiment, and do that again and back. Well, and that's a 12-hour experiment too. So I appreciate him a lot. So to the outside supporter, I want to thank Naveen Starvels from Feinstein. Well, I suppose show your face. So Naveen and Starvels, as well as Lauren from West Virginia University. Without your support, I would still be stuck in doing my rat vagus nerve recording. And Dan Elias from FDA, Ben and Yon Cho from Harvard. I appreciate your collaboration and insights on the optical project, OCT. Thanks for Ben and Mafada from University of Bath for stimulating discussion. And to Yue and Hans from Academia Sinica in Taiwan for resources, basically giving me a home for my research during COVID. I also acknowledge the NIH Spark program for funding that made much of my research possible. Beyond the lab, I'm grateful for Dan Peterson, Danny Chong, Lise, Richard Herod, Joe Linton, Vice, for your unwavering support. Mark Chain, thank you for being a sounding board during my career transition and for your mentorship. And to in-laws, thank you for your staff as support, for my own family, mom and dad. Thank you for always standing by me through this really long years of PhD. And your conditional support meant everything. Lastly, to my wife, Rachel, this degree is as much yours as it is mine. I could not have done it without your support and believe in me. And to Virginia, my mother-in-law, Your editing help and encouragement were deeply appreciated. Thank you all for sincerely. And every journey involves capturing photos of scenery, right? These are the scenes I captured during my PhD. And thank you for being part of it.
These pictures are gorgeous. So we went a little bit over, which is a shock to no one. So I'm going to leave it 2 public questions. I'd like to do one from the room and possibly one online if one comes up. If not, we'll do a second from the room. And then we'll go to the closed session. And the question cannot be, if you go back a slide, what in the world was the look on Nishant's face? All right, question from the crowd. I'm hugging my Diet Coke. Brandon.
So Rex, first of all, very excellent talk. This was obviously a culmination of all your work. You've done quite a bit. So my first question, I guess my question is in the activation origin framework, as we look at sort of the exponential log linear movement of the fiber velocities towards where they are above threshold, have we looked at the consistency of that migration as those move to their final resting velocities? Because there could be some really interesting vagus nerve signal processing happening as that's going. Because a lot of things aren't acting at this massive above threshold when we apply electrostimulation. As we titrate it out, do we have a measure of the consistency of that logarithmic settlement?
So you're talking about different diameter fiber will be recruited at different amplitude? Is
right.
that?
There's
Yeah.
a figure early on that showed progression towards fiber velocities towards hitting their
A plateau,
peak.
yeah.
Yeah, lower thresholds. And
That is actually showing the diameter of the fiber
Right.
and their threshold. So I know you can correlate the diameter with the velocity, which becomes the graph that you said.
Right.
But yeah, so you're right. You can correlate that. So we would expect, so in our calculation, we're assuming constant velocity, which is, it's kind of like assuming a Gaussian distribution of a velocity, and then we're just picking the center. But this Gaussian distribution of a velocity is actually, as you increase the dose, you recruit the sort of lower end of a velocity, and higher end of velocity, and as you increase your dose, you're gonna get the lower end. So we're not accounting the model or our calculation with those, but I think that's a really great point, and I think the simulation of the future models might be able to capture those, and then might gain us more insights and actually correct for the initial, I think the initial activation origin that shows up at the threshold, it's a little off because of that. Because you're gonna get a little bit higher velocity at the beginning, and thus you're gonna have a high, a longer distance.
So we also have the online question from Whitney alumnus / member Dr. Evan Nikolai. Can you read it to the group because they can't see it, and then answer it? Assuming you can see it. If not, I can read it to the group.
I can also read it if you'd rather me just read it.
That'll work. Floor is yours,
All right.
Dr. Nikolai.
Nice talk, Rex. Brought up some really interesting ideas. So when you talk about your activation origin work, you had kind of a long distance between your stimulation and recording electrodes.
Yep.
And what do you think the minimum distance between your electrodes could be? Because as we know, if we're going to do this in humans, potentially just thinking about how to use this practically, we want to keep the surgical window small. So what do you think the minimum distance between your stimulation and recording electrodes could be?
First of all, for recording, just for this nerve signal alone, actually the closer you are, the better. But you can't be too close because then you can get some stimulus artifact from your stimulation. So the closer you are, the better. We don't have I think this is an open, really, a few questions. This paradigm that we have with activation origin really opens up, okay, how close can we get? And because we imagine, if you're inside of the recruited volume, which is the activation origin, within the activation origin boundaries, then you actually don't get a propagation delay because everything is activated at the same time. And so you can't be too close. So for A alpha fiber, or A beta that we saw in the slides, we get 3 to 4 centimeter of a essentially one side of a volume. So if you are a really high dose, you probably don't want to be that close for A alpha fiber. But for a slower fiber, we've been seeing pretty consistent. It doesn't grow that much. So I kind of have to say I think you could get probably as close as like 1 or 2 centimeter, and you still would be able to capture the slower signal, which is what we generally care, actually. Those are the therapeutic fibers. And whereas A alpha and A beta are a muscle signal that we don't really care, because we know they're present if the muscle contract, or EMG could show them up as well. So great question.
Yeah, that makes sense, Rex. Thanks.
That was a great answer, actually. So one last round of applause. And all the committee members are in the room. So for those of you online, Rex is going to sign out. For those of you who are not committee members, you can file out. For those of you who are committee members and have to use the restroom quickly, please be back in 2 to 3 minutes, and I will join you.